Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and may we settle down. My name is Nwabisa Makunga, and I'm the deputy editor for the Herald newspaper here in Port Elizabeth. I am here as a partner to, am I using this mic or this mic? All right. Oh, fantastic. I'm here as a partner representing TISO Black Star with CANRAD. And we really would like to thank the wonderful work that the university and CANRAD are doing to cultivate a culture of conversation, important conversations that need to be had, such as the one we will be having tonight. As all of you know, this is the PE leg of a book launch of a very, very important book that should shed some light on a very crucial time of our history. It's a book written by Mr. Mandla Langa, and I think many of you may have copies. If you do not, it is on sale outside. It's called Dare Not Linger. If I may just introduce the author. Ubaba Mandla was born in Durban. He grew up in Kwamashu Township. He studied, and Visi says, he studied at the University of Fort Hare. And in 1980, he won the drum story contest for the dead men who lost their bones. In 1991, he's been writing for a very long time, clearly. In 1991, he was awarded the Arts Council of Great Britain bursary for creative writing. He was the first South African to be awarded the award. He's published a lot of work, which I'll mention just a few. One of them being Tenderness of Blood, which was published in 1987. A Rainbow on a Paper Sky, published the following year in 1989. The Naked Song and Other Stories, published in 1997. And The Memory of Stones, published in 2000. And of course, many of you may know this one, The Lost Colors of the Chameleon, published in 2008. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Mandla Langa. The next speaker is a person I believe you know very well. He's a colleague to many of you in the university. He'll be our respondent for tonight. His name is Barrington Murray. He is a lecturer in English Studies here at the University of Nelson Mandela. His interests, I'm told, center around textual representations of marginal identities in South African literature, with a specific focus on themes relating to gender, to sexuality, to spirituality. I understand he was awarded his MA at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, cum laude in 2013, and he is currently busy with his PhD thesis on a very interesting topic, I might add. It is entitled Morphes, Misfits, and Misogynists, Representations of Colored Masculinities in Selected South African Texts. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for Mr. Barrington Murray. To begin this evening, may I please call Umama Wetu, the VC of the university, Professor Sibongile Mutha, to welcome everybody here.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great honor and privilege to welcome you to the Herald Mandela University Community Dialogue. Thanks, Nwabisa, and the launch of the book, Dare Not Linger, The Presidential Years. We very much value this partnership with the Herald. I also congratulate Mandela University Center for Non-racialism and Democracy, who are hosting this event with the Herald. I prefer to call CANRAD with its full name because people do not know, some of them, what it stands for. It is very important for us that we call it by its full name, the Center for Non-racialism and Democracy. Uput Mandla, I met him in London. As it has been said, it's actually, he's a prolific a doyen of literature. So we are honored to have you with us here today, especially on this Africa Month. I congratulate the author for this far-sighted project, which very judiciously completes what could have been an unfinished project. We are so much richer as a nation primarily, as freedom-loving people more generally, as this work adds to our appreciation of the intellectual resilience and forbearance and political complexity of what is entailed in the work of nation building. Dare Not Linger is the story of Mandela's presidency, drawing on his own unfinished memoir, as told in his own words and those of acclaimed South African writer Mandla Langa. The book is an inspirational account of Mandela's years as the first democratically elected president of South Africa, and it tells the extraordinary story of the transition from decades of oppressive apartheid rule into a fully functioning democracy in which all citizens are equal before the law. I am also very proud that Mandla comes from KZN, even though now he has become the global citizen. We are currently celebrating Africa Month at the university, and a few years back we started a proud tradition of inviting key literary figures to stimulate our thinking about key issues confronting the African continent. This year we are indebted to have you, Mandla, as a doyen of many literary accolades, as Nwabisa has pointed out to us. We are very grateful for accepting this invitation from the Herald and Mandela University, especially given that the title of this book resonates with our celebration of the centenary year of Mandela's birth, which at this university we're kicking it off now this year in July to next year. Nelson Mandela was a man of integrity, I don't need to say that, who dedicated his whole life to creating a more humane and just society. As a university community, we are fully aware that the privilege of bearing his name comes with a huge responsibility from our part to lead society. It is expected of all of Nelson Mandela University students and staff to live the incredible legacy of Nelson Mandela and embrace the values that he stood for. In his address at the launch of the new name of our university in July last year, the then Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa challenged us to position our institutional identity and culture in line with Mandela's ethos of love for humanity and his lifelong commitment to social justice. So we dare not linger. This is why the quote by Nelson Mandela, from which the title of the book being launched tonight is drawn, is so apt for our time. He said, "I have discovered the secret that after climbing a great hill, one only finds that there are many more hills to climb. I have taken a moment here to rest, to steal a view of the glorious vista that surrounds me, to look back on the distance I have come. But I can only rest for a moment, for with freedom comes responsibility. And I dare not linger, for my long walk is not ended." Close quote. We dare not linger as we climb the hill towards a better life for our nation and for Africa. I welcome you this evening. Thank you.
Without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please do welcome our author for the night, Mr. Mandla Langa.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sisbongile, Siyabonga kakhulu, and thanks to Nwabisa here and my discussant, Barrington. You don't mind if I sit down? Eh? Okay, because you also sit down anyway. I thought we would have this kind of conversation rather than a reading, one-way traffic as if you are watching television. So we'll have a conversation after a while. And I would like to hear your views because the theme of my talk today, discursive as it is on what is South Africa's attitude towards its own treasury. And that treasury means the people that we have in our lives that have ignited this country. It could be Nelson Mandela, it could be anyone, it could be any individual or groups of individuals who have made great strides and have made us proud of who we are. Some time back, I was speaking to a Muslim school of Muslim kids in Lodium. And these were grade 6, 7, 8, young, very young people. So here I was reading from my other novel, Texture of Shadows. And one of the two young women or girls, because they are really very small, was discussing with her friend at the back there. And then her friend, then they decided to ask this question. So she raised her hand and I said, yes. She said, are you famous where you come from? So I thought about this and I had to come with a quick answer, because if there's one thing that intimidates me, it's young people. So there you have it. So I said, I think people might know me on my street, but I certainly am famous in my house. Then she said, you see, to her friend, I told you, he's not famous at all. The point I'm trying to make is that I'm not saying that I'm a great person, but I'm just extrapolating from that to how South Africans, how we look at our icons. A lot of my friends are people who, one of them passed away early this year. This was Willie Khositsile. He was the country's national poet, laureate. And he became known only after he had been in the United States. And I find that a lot of, let's say, theater plays, a play like Woza Albert will invariably be embraced by South Africans once it has done a circuit on Broadway. And to that extent then, and this is something that I want us to mull over, because there has been a lot that has been happening in South Africa recently, at least for the past 8 or so months. And this has it reached almost an hysterical pitch after the passing away of Comrade Winnie Nomzamo Madikizela Mandela. And this was the trashing of our icons, of our leaders, of people that suddenly we found ourselves having a situation of binaries. We say that if so-and-so has been elevated to the extent that we regard them as a national or international icon, then we look at who has elevated them. And then by dint of that, that person is ipso facto a sellout or someone that needs to be trashed. And I look at that and I remember from the time when we were in exile, when we were in the ANC, when we were beginning to deal with the Release Mandela campaign. We were outside the country. There were people who were fighting inside the country, who were making sure that because the world and South Africa needed a focal point, someone that was going to be looked upon as embodying the struggle. That's when Oliver Tambo, working together with his council in the ANC, decided that this campaign needs to center on one person. Tambo was the president of the ANC, but he felt that Nelson Mandela, the Amnesty International had refused to grant him the status of prisoner of conscience. But the ANC felt that there has to be, working together with the mass democratic movement inside the country, in those incredibly bloody years, the 1980s, to make sure that this one name is the name that we will push throughout to make sure that the world recognizes Nelson Mandela, not the body, not the corpus of Nelson Mandela, but the symbolic representation of the struggle should be invested in this one person. And so that happened. Now, this comes to the thing I was saying earlier. It is South Africans that catapulted Nelson Mandela to the stellar heights that he reached. But we are seeing him now through the eyes, God knows what eyes, and we seem to feel that he has been put up there by the West. The West only piggybacked on our success. I'm trying to say here that we have to be able to find a way of claiming what is ours, what has been put out there on our own terms, and not praise people because they are being praised, or look at them through the eyes of someone that has been catapulted to greatness by the West. We need to be coming also to the question of the Constitution. You know, you as some of you are students, some of you are staff, some of you are academics, many of you are academics. You do sociology. Almost all sociology tracts, lectures, will take you to the greatness of the Constitution of the United States. It will laud the technicality, the intellectual prowess, the fact that there was a lot of rigor that was put into this. We have a constitution in South Africa. Men, women went all over the globe to try and find the highest possible values in just about all the constitutions of the world, to try and see to what extent people could come out and workshop a constitution that could work for this country. In a sense then, we are, to my mind, and you'll call me up on this when we have a Q&A, whether my postulate is wrong. In my mind, I believe that we run ourselves down, we do ourselves down, we are not really gifted of the vision of looking at what is good and best in us, in ourselves. And then it's only when someone else comes up and says, this is very good, then we will say, because someone else has said this is very good, then it must be bad. I want to start reading from the book. As has been said, Nelson Mandela had written in his own handwriting almost 70,000 words, which of course in any circumstance could make up a sizable piece of writing. But it was all in various, and there were a couple of repetitions, but all in all, he did write in his own words what he was going through, what he was seeing, his impressions during what we call the presidential years. So the book is about the presidential years. It does not go to any other period except, of course, as background. And so I was given this brief. I was lucky. It was a very intimidating brief. I'm not used to writing non-fiction. I'm used to writing fiction because in fiction you can say anything you want. And no one will call you up. But you can't say anything you want about Nelson Mandela. They will certainly, you'll hear from publishers, you'll hear from a lot of people, you'll hear from lawyers. And so the brief I got was to take various archival materials, minutes, the records that were done by the people that were his advisors in his office, people like Joel Nejitenje and Tony True, and of course the material that existed in the Nelson Mandela Foundation, and the records in the ANC and so on and so forth. Because the brief was to try and make this quote and unquote to sing, I had to find a way of, if you are dealing with a piece of music, you have to find complementary instrumentation to enhance the lyric or the words or the music or the melody. So that is what I thought I was doing, and that is what hopefully I did. Where I failed, it's not Mandela's melody that failed, it is my interpretation, it is my instrumentation, where, for instance, I should have involved a choir, I brought in a bass guitar. You'll have to pardon me for that. I'll start to read because I think this is a section that is very important for the kind of conversation that we are going to be having and for what I was saying earlier. How much time do I have? 10 minutes. Okay. Mandela was receiving intelligence reports to the effect that the right-wing Afrikaners had decided to stop the forthcoming election by violence. To be on the safe side, the president of an organization must carefully check the accuracy of such reports. That's Mandela now speaking. I did so, and when I discovered that they were accurate, I decided to act. And so Mandela knew better than to underestimate an opponent hell-bent on wreaking havoc, especially one that perceived itself to be on a just crusade to preserve vanishing glories. In his quest for a solution, he might have been thinking of some of the stalwarts, like Chief Albert Luthuli, the Nobel Prize laureate, whose stewardship of the ANC had been at a most difficult time in the 1960s. What would he have made of this situation? or Oliver Tambo, his friend and comrade who died on 24 April, barely 2 weeks after Chris Hani burial? What course of action would he have advanced? In making his decision, however, Mandela must have been hearing echoes of Martin Luther King Jr.'s lecture on receiving the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. Quote, "Violence as a way of achieving racial justice is both impractical and immoral," unquote, Dr. King said. "I am not unmindful of the fact that violence often brings about momentary results. Nations have frequently won their independence in battle, but in spite of temporary victories, violence never brings permanent peace. It solves no social problem. It merely creates new and more complicated ones. Violence is impractical because it is a descending spiral ending in destruction for all," unquote. And so Mandela then went to see P.W. Botha, the groot crocodile, in a wilderness, because he believed, as I'm sure anyone who has ever grown up in a township, you know that if you've got to deal with a bully, you need to go and talk to the bully's friend. So he went to talk to the bully's friend, that was P.W. And he says, "I informed him that the peace was now threatened by the right wing and asked him to intervene. He was cooperative and confirmed that Afrikaners were determined to stop the elections. But he added that he did not want to discuss the matter with me alone, excuse me, and suggested that I bring President F.W. de Klerk, Ferdy Hartenberg, and the general." That's General Constant Viljoen. "I propose that we should also include the leader of the extreme Afrikaner right wing, Eugene Terblanche, on the grounds that he was a reckless demagogue who at that time could attract large crowds, larger crowds than President de Klerk. On that issue, the former president was so negative that I decided to drop the subject." So that was that. And then, but the violence did come, and I just want to come to this part here. The rejection of the right-wingers' demands precipitated mayhem. Mandela writes that, quote, "On the eve of the elections, bombs exploded, especially in Johannesburg, and killed about 20 innocent civilians. It was a matter of police action, and the culprits were arrested and convicted. The situation would have imposed formidable difficulties if Viljoen was still part of the plot. The media at home and abroad, which had been watching the unfolding drama with interest, reported how the elements of the right wing made good on their threat to try and disrupt the elections. The explosions, according to Bill Keller in the New York Times, quote, "Most minor but ominous in their message, led some panicky residents to stockpile household goods, but seemed only to harden the resolve of black voters to exercise their first franchise. Bolstered by the united condemnation of politicians and by their own lifetimes of being denied, even blacks in the line of fire said they would not be frightened from voting." Quote, "Someone is trying to scare us away from the election," said Zola Mtseni, who was sitting in his baby blue minibus chatting with a friend when the Germiston blast suddenly lifted his vehicle into the air and smashed all the windows. Scores of vehicles gather each morning in suburban taxi parks to bring commuters into the city to work. Bandaged but unbowed, he returned from the hospital to retrieve his taxi and accept the condolences of whites who stopped to commiserate. They are wasting their time, he said of the spoilers. We are going. Mr. Mseni's 3 words, we are going, almost certainly meant that he, his colleagues and their families were going to vote, come hell or high water. A few decades earlier, such determination might not have been there. But now that the resistance had gained a foothold in every corner of the country, it had started to become a reality. As a taxi driver, he might have ferried thousands of passengers and heard their tales of woe, which reflected the reality of what he and his peers had endured. And then one day, change began to seem possible. In 1976, the youth in schools had revolted against the imposition of Afrikaans as a language of instruction. In response, the regime had tightened its chokehold around the necks of the people and declared states of emergency. To many, this was a sign that the apartheid government was losing its grip. In the words of American writer James Baldwin, on the decline of a kingdom, he says, force does not work the way its advocates seem to think it does. It does not, for example, reveal to the victim the strength of the adversary. On the contrary, it reveals the weakness, even the panic of his adversary, and this revelation invests the victim with patience. Furthermore, it is ultimately fatal to create too many victims. When 8 men were released from prison on 13 October 1989, it heralded the end of a system that had led to so much pain and signaled that the walls were coming down. The hour of the victim had come, and then on 11 February 1990, almost 120 days later, Mandela stepped out and it all became real. At last, it was happening. All the songs that people had sung in churches, in the lips of open graves and in the camps thousands of miles from home, all transmuted into an affirmation. We are going to cast our vote. 7 simple words whose import had eluded the architects of apartheid for decades. The Afrikaner right wing had failed. Thank you.
I'm not even going to try and analyze that in any possible way. Ladies and gentlemen, please do welcome Barrington Murray. Do you want to sit? Do you want a conversation sitting there?
Yeah, I think I'll be fine here. Good evening to Mr. Zinn and CANRAD. Thank you for inviting me. I was in one of these sessions when I first started my career, and one of the gentlemen said to me, "What can you add to this? You still have baby formula on your breath." So I'm hoping that I can add something useful to the conversation. Langa, I really admire your work and applaud you for undertaking what I imagine was a heavily negotiated and labor-intensive and undoubtedly complex task. I can't imagine what it was like to get through this and maintain both the authenticity of Mandela's voice as well as sort of negotiating ways to represent the text. All right. So as we approach the milestone of the Mandela centenary in July this year, one can't help but contrast the established narrative around his legacy And when I say that established narrative, essentially what I'm talking about is sort of speaking into the Rainbow Nation narrative and that sort of idealistic view of one nation, Pride Day is our common heritage type thing, you know, which is obviously problematic. So for a lot of young people, and I see that this is quite, if you look at social media and populist ideas, there's a lot of detraction in terms of what Mandela has achieved. He's been called a sellout. In the words of, and I quote Mamweni, we over-negotiated. So we're living in a time where the youth are facing a lot of challenges in terms of employment, and the overall socio-political and economical situation is complex, and it's a complex terrain to traverse. So a lot of us are disillusioned. And this book, I think, speaks to that. It allows the opportunity for us to get insight into the workings of the Mandela, not the legacy as such, but his time in office. So for many Africans, they perceive and experience their freedom in terms of, the Mandela legacy is inextricably linked to how many Africans perceive and experience their freedom. So there's that sort of sentimentality in how we experience our freedom, and a lot of that has to do with symbolism. And I mean, we might want to deny it, but Mandela was in many ways portrayed in the media as a sort of Christ-like figure, you know? Having borne the violent wrath of an oppressive system in efforts to save a nation as such, to the point where you don't really want to be the one saying something negative, because it isn't the popular thing to do. But I'll sort of get into that a little bit more. I think for a lot of people and for many detractors, why they reject this representation of President Mandela is that they view it as a farce, a way to quell the masses essentially by reflecting freedom in a symbolic way. So if we think about, for example, his release, there was a media blitz around it, and it was the perfect photo op. And symbolically, that said freedom. Mandela is free. That means we're all free. Then the election came. We can imagine that iconic photograph of him casting his first vote. Another symbol, speaking of freedom. And for a long time, that's been digestible for a lot of people. And it's sort of the accepted narrative. I was speaking to a friend of mine who's currently putting together, he's a curator at a museum, and he's currently putting together a piece, a collection of art based on the centenary. And he described to me the complexity in doing that, in that you don't want to be critical of the legacy because that isn't the popular thing to do, especially in 2018 when we're celebrating the centenary. You know, here you are at the centenary, you know, and you're presenting something possibly subversive and something that might yield some sort of outrage. Right, sacrilegious as such, if we go back to that sort of religious imagery there, that Christ-like figure. I know that I'm sounding a little bit biased at the moment, but please humor me. The conversation will develop, and it's greatly informed by the beautiful text that I had the chance to read. Okay, so I spoke about Mandela casting that first vote. And it seemed on the surface that South Africans were free, whatever freedom meant. And I don't know if everyday South Africans had conceptualized this idea of freedom. Because freedom can mean one thing to another, and freedom can be sold very much as a dominant narrative, and something that becomes the popular belief. But is there any genuine interrogation of what freedom is? We can mull these things up on the higher, you know, in terms of that hierarchy that positions some of us on the very top there. Mull those things out and legislate them. But how do they necessarily translate? How do we ensure that they have meaning and that they have a place and purpose and are functional, essentially? Okay. So, and I'm stating the obvious when I put forward the fact that South Africa reflects shocking disparities in terms of wealth distribution and access to basic amenities, all right? And I think that this is what has opened up the conversation around the aspects of Mandela's legacy and really held it to scrutiny. When you're not eating, that's a different reality, you know? In the university environment, we see this as well. All over, we see this. So you're telling me about the beautiful ideologies that you support and you propose, and that's lovely. As they've dubbed him, Deputy Jesus, who I love, Desmond Tutu, right? Not my words, not my words. Speaking about the Rainbow Nation, and I mean, it sounds wonderful. It sounds wonderful, it's idealistic. And it also is a safe space. And it creates the sense of unity. And I mean, I'm not talking about a fractured society or proposing a fractured society, but something more realistic, I suppose. All right, so this then begs the question, so I've gone on my rant, my ANC Youth League rant. This then begs the question of whether this particular book can add anything meaningful to the discussions around ANC policy, political motives, nation building, strategy, key discussions, and the practical elements of transition. So we're talking at that particular time that may shed light on the way that things are at present. How am I doing for time?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay, I'm going to carry on. But also to answer that, I think that this text actually does that, is that it does shed light into that particular time, which I think is vital. Because I think we've sort of moved with a lot of populist ideas that force us to reject what was done in our past. I think of a Thandiswa Mazwai song, Nizalwa Gomban, and she says, the world changes, revolutionaries die, and the children forget. And I think that that's what we're living in at the moment. So to speak back to the text, I think it systematically illuminates the process behind many of the decisions that shape our present. Mandela is revealed to be conscientious, and I don't use these words lightly. As is represented in the text, conscientious, principled, and a decisive leader, ultimately aiming to facilitate, the political transition of a country, we must remember, in great peril. So some level of negotiation has to happen. And some level of sacrifice, I suppose, has to happen. But that doesn't necessarily reflect the ideologies of this man. Per se, we may want to say, hey, you politician, everything about you means that you're answerable. But I think it's a little bit unfair in the circumstances, considering what he was up against. So I am a life writing scholar, so I was very interested genre-wise in the text. And my fear was that it was going to be a hagiography, essentially a celebration of a life more than a critical look at this life lived. And I must say that when I saw Mandla Langa, that went out of my mind. And it sort of traverses the literary genres because it's quite dynamic in that it reads as a historical account as well as a memoiric reflection. And it also is quite important, I think, for the overall political, even if it isn't a conscious political memory project, but a necessary memory project. So in terms of archiving information and that sort of thing. Yeah, thank you for allowing me to speak on your text.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening to me.
So we'll take 3 rounds of questions, and my panelists will respond, and then we'll move on. And depending on time, I do need to give them a sufficient time at the end to kind of round everything up and give us that last kind of punch. Okay, so I'll take 3 questions. Olwam, I see you. Put in a red t-shirt, I see you. And I do see you as well. So Olwam, you can go.
Masikakhulu sis, masibulise kuBaba Langa. Siyabulela uba uze apha, unkosikazi wami ndamthatha kwaMashu. So you are more of an uncle. I think whenever we talk about Nelson Mandela, we are bound to look at his contribution. And for this generation, my generation, maybe a little bit younger ones, will also look at him with the benefit of the hindsight. You know, the decision that were taken when he took the decisions might not have been, you know, the same reflection as if he would take them today. Because when you take a decision in the late 80s, in Port Elizabeth, we know that there was pay cause and the youth revolt and a lot of activities generally in the country, and it had been over 50 years at that time of Mandela's generation struggle of the Youth League. So when you look back, we have that benefit of the hindsight of being in a free country, in a democratic country, and we tend to think looking at Mandela's legacy critically means to negate and nullify what has been accomplished. I'm opposed to that. I feel that generation, it has taken them from when the Youth League, I suppose, was formed in the 40s, about 60 years, to accomplish what they have accomplished in the early 90s. So I always take that position. Secondly, I want to add on that, when we critique and look at Nelson Mandela, the embodiment of the person Mandela and his contribution and his generation, we also reserve the right to critique and not find, you know, only good things when you look at them. So now we are standing in 2018, there are issues of land that are coming, there are issues of free education, there are issues of healthcare and so forth, and the leadership that they actually left for us. So we have to go negative without nullifying what they have contributed, without feeling that we are negating their contribution. But it's the time and day where we need to start where it started. And yes, it did start at CODESA in some instances. So lastly, my point is this, that the self-imposed compulsion of maintaining the deification of Mandela is going to hurt us. We don't have to maintain the icon and the angel Mandela. We actually don't. We didn't come up with that. What we can do, we can own up with his contribution, at the same time starting with the issues of land, with the issues of free education, with the issue of decolonizing education and higher education as our contribution, not necessarily as the negation of his contribution to the struggle. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Budam. You can go.
Thank you very much, and thank you again to all the speakers. Thank you, Bablang. Funny enough, my question is also centered around his youth activism as well in the ANC Youth League. But my question is as follows. Can we really separate Nelson Mandela from the ANC, understanding that it was Nelson Mandela, a young revolutionary, who him and other comrades took a decision to say that there must be an ANC Youth League as well as rebel against the current leadership of the ANC at the time because of their modest approach towards the genuine struggles of the people. So can we really separate Nelson Mandela from the ANC? Because you had a Nelson Mandela shifting from that young revolutionary, and I don't want to then say to a sellout, but rather to a more diplomatic sort of leader at the helm of the ANC. So can you separate the Nelson Mandela from the general diplomatic approach that has been seen through the various leaders of the ANC after the years of time? Thank you.
Thank you very much. The third question.
Thank you so much. I'm obviously Nkululo. Thank you to the speakers, for the content, But now coming from the side of when the legacy of Mandela now gets questioned and where even the word sellout comes from, because as you have said that he seemed to be made this Jesus Christ, and now. When now is the youth were actually starting to question things, because, well, it's not a debate of the role that he has played, spending 27 years in prison. But then the question now comes to say, does then that exempt you from having your moral choices to be questioned? Because of the number of years you've spent. Have you spent those years, but now does it mean you cannot question the moral choices that you have taken after? And particularly on, if for example we can speak about his idea of the Rainbow Nation. Yeah, it sounds fine, but now this Rainbow Nation now that seeks to value the lives of another and turn oblivion to the struggles of the other, and normalizing that struggle of the other, that exploitation. So it's normal for a black person, to be educated, to die poor. It's normal, no one cares, But now speak about land just once, the countries that stand still now, property rights and whatnot. For example, not so long ago, last year the rand was weakening, right? And there was Save SA, across the country marching, And then the rand, okay, fine, was then stable. But now the conditions of the poor did not change because of the stable rand. They remain the same. And now there was no Save SA now, because it's seemingly now like we're more concerned now when certain lives are affected. But for other ones, it's normal. I know it's fine. So now that's the Rainbow Nation that we're trying to question now, to say this Rainbow Nation is built upon the conditions that continue to suppress the other. Is it even real, that Rainbow Nation? And because we make a mistake now of thinking that...
We do need to try and get it, please, Butam.
Work
with me here.
Okay, no.
Just your last point, final point, very straightforward.
Final point, okay, yes. So now that is then the question to say now, even constitutionally speaking now, because we have a constitution, so do we then say now, yes, we are completely free and therefore now we cannot question some of the people, and even the leaders who are still alive today? Because seeming like all of them, they're sleeping, that they're just saying a lullaby to them, Tula Papani. And so now when the youth speaks, they get vilified, So I'll just stop there, just not to prolong.
And guys, thank you very much. Babulanga, which question will you be taking?
I'll take...
Were they all for him, or is he allowed to leave the most difficult one to Barrington?
No, I think I will address myself to the general essence to the general thrust of the questions. And I'm hoping that Barrington, and I'm hoping that, I said it must be a conversation. It must not be an interrogation. We're not, you know, there's one thing that I want to say, which I think it would have been very helpful to have read the book, where the point I was trying to also make is the point of not so much of the times in which everything happened, but I think I do need to go to that prison, that 27 years that is being questioned, as it were. I won't say impugned, in the sense that Mandela spent that time not just on holiday. He used the time to study a host of circumstances, a host of countries, a host of history where conflict had taken place. He studied India, what had happened with the partition in 1947, what had happened in the Philippines with the nationalist struggle there and the communists and the Hags, what happened in East Timor, what happens in a number of jurisdictions. And so in his mind, framed in his thinking, was this looming catastrophe. And so he was single-mindedly wedded to the principle, to the ideal of creating a stable South Africa, a stable South Africa that would be underpinned by democracy. And so it's when you build a house, including the whole process of the negotiations. I will encapsulate them in this analogy of a father figure or a mother figure, it doesn't matter, building a house and ensuring that in this house there would be life, there would be the young people who are vulnerable. And those young people stretch the analogy to mean democracy, to mean the people of South Africa. But in building a house and making sure that it's got everything inside it, it's got furniture, it's on stable foundations, you are not by any stretch of the imagination then required to be the one that pays lobola to make sure that, and also ensuring that there's procreation in this house, there's life, there are children that get born. Yours is to make sure that this house has been built. Let the others who are living in this house, who are part of it, part of this building, take part in making sure that life continues. I think it is very, 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 I'll say unfair, because I can't find a word really that I can come up with to go to that question, to separate Nelson Mandela from the policy positions of the ANC. It is Oliver Tambo in 1986 had already started the process of getting the legal minds who were inside the country. My brother was one of those minds who went all over the places to try and find a way in which the ANC's own legal and constitutional committee could start grappling with the question of negotiations, because that was something that was a reality. If you are dealing with a regime like the regime that we had in this country, that we still have in this country, in one way or the other, because the rumor that apartheid is dead is a rumor. when you had people being killed the way they were killed. You know, even as you sit here today, videos, snippets are coming out because you know that that whole archive, some of it was banned, but there's a lot that is still resurfacing. And we only know what is resurfacing about the lives of people that have got the resources to make sure that those things become known. There are people who are mute in some of the far-flung areas where horrible things were done to them. That is the regime we're talking about. And so we can't be flippant and say that notwithstanding the 27 years, that 27 years was a manifestation of the blood of those people that we're talking about. People are buried in the camps. I was one of those people who was in the camps in Angola, where people died. Now, we must have a sense of proportionality. We must not look at what is happening today and see the corruption and think that South Africa only started being a country in 1994, or corruption started with Jacob Zuma. No. You know, we need to have a sense of history. And so I'm saying that people please read the book, argue with the book, argue with its take on history, but don't, you know, there's this thing of saying now, today, you are woke if you criticize. You know, let's not be woke, let's wake up. You know?
Like that.
Barrington, let us not be woke. Let us let us wake up. In that context, there was a question, I'm interested in that question that was asked about the separation between Nelson Mandela, the person, and the ANC, the movement. Can those two be separated?
Absolutely not.
They cannot.
As far as I'm concerned, absolutely not. Absolutely not. I think the ideals and ideologies that are purported by the ANC, Nelson Mandela lived them. And we might want to be, I mean, the woke thing is to be critical about that and sort of level those sort of criticisms. But the one thing that we can see is that he was always faithful to the movement. He did what was right to the movement, sometimes to the point of personal loss. So it was the ultimate sacrifice for him. So I think it's a bit unfair if we want to separate him from the movement. I don't know, it just opens a realm of discussion that I think is problematic and possibly without base. But I guess an argument could be made for anything, you know how things go. But point blank, no.
All right, I'll take another round of 3 questions. May I have some hands? I see you, Budwam, at the back there. I also see you. And I see. Can we start with the lady, please, if you do not mind?
I thank you very much for your contributions, and I'm looking forward to reading the book. I was wondering, sir, what you would think about the contributions of our born-frees, if we could call them that, and their criticism of our current democratic state. I think it's very, and this is what I've been told by my mother, in actual fact, that it's very easy to be critical of a democracy you have when not recognizing the one that you didn't. So I'd like to know what your take is on this generation who has the freedom to critique. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will take that other question at the back there.
Thank you very much. Greetings to the panel in front. My name is Njabulo Mdlalose, second year. political sciences and public administration students. Look, the whole notion of the Rainbow Nation by Nelson Mandela, for his take at that time, seemed to be the right decision. But now, as the years went on, I think they did an uncalculated move. They didn't think of the dire consequences that would come out of that Rainbow Nation. Because now what we did is that we knocked a giant on the head and it went to faint. But now the sleeping giant is awakening, and we don't know how to deal with that. For instance, in South Africa, you have people who are suffering from poverty. And then you have two different opposing sides. Now, in general human nature, it's either you relate or you reason. Failure to do both either means you're arrogant or you're ignorant. But in the sense of South Africa, they're failing. The ones that don't suffer from poverty, because of this Rainbow Nation notion, falsified notion, they can't relate. We understand that. You can't relate, you've never been through it. But then you fail to reason as well. We just recently, for an example, we had an event at a case here at our institution where people were striking for food. Food, poverty. How can you strike for food? Just think of it, food, a basic human right. So personally for me as a young person, I feel that it's just out. The whole notion of a Rainbow Nation, it doesn't work for me. As a young person coming from Guamash there in Durban, growing up poor, it doesn't work. So, and then you also have a case where the same person that is sort of like idolized like Mandela, because they were trying to phase out Zuma. The same person they're trying to idolize comes in with the notion of a new dawn. Now tell me, what new dawn do you have without young people? They keep bringing back same people who were there in 1994, who were ministers. They are still ministers even today. They are still ministers even today. So for me, the whole Rainbow Nation notion just doesn't stand. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. We'll take the third question at the back.
Kiabonga Baba. This thing of Rainbow Nation, really. Think of it. Colors over one another, above another. I mean, they're not one, but it's fine, it's fine. But I just want to ask, you discussed and you spoke about something very interesting when you spoke about freedom, and then you asked what is Mandela free from? What is Mandela free to do? Are we free to subject ourselves, surrender ourselves by choice, not by force, as in colonization and apartheid? Because we still have poor people and poor working people that subject themselves into the systems that are problematic for them. The second question is, Kuya Baba Babulanga, do you think the negotiations really went so well, and were they amplified, were they like assisted by Truth and Reconciliation Commission that Desmond Tutu came with? Was not a truth and reconciliation justice instead should have been better than Truth and Reconciliation Commission for black people, Truth and Reconciliation for white people, Truth and Reconciliation Justice, not commission? Because justice, we understand, I come from Lusikiseki. When a big boy come beat me up, I go call my older brother to come like reconciliate and all of that. And
We got you, Putu. I mean, I think that mic going off is a signal.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Sabotage.
Bablanga, I think there's a thread here and I think you probably came up with the word about reconciliation and justice, because a lot of the questions really, at the heart of them revolve around justice, social justice, but also the impact of inequality. How do we answer that? How do we negotiate? How do we navigate, rather, the situation we're in right now?
Okay, I'll just say my 2 cents worth of the first question was the criticism by the born frees, and since I'm not one of the born frees, I will strive to think how it must be to have been in a situation of the born frees. I think history, all history is a chain, it's a relay. Those who come before us, I'm sure the Mandelas and the Tambos were also critical of those who had come before them. And those who had come before them were critical of Bambata and so on and so forth. So it goes all the way back, and then it has to go. We were critical of the people we found in the camps, ANC camps. We came full of fire, vim and vinegar. We were going to change everything overnight. All these old men, who are finishing food here in Tanzania, we're going to do one thing with them. We're going to be here only 6 months to study how to fight, then go back home. We even came with they even called us Abo Qiniselani, because we came with this song, Qiniselani, and so on and so forth. We stayed longer than we had thought. So in a sense, we need to be alive to the continuum, to the handover that happens. And it's only with that gracious spirit that we can make it as a people, to know that certain things could happen at a particular time and not, and now that we are in this time, we're operating in a free country. To answer that question, we're operating in a free country where all these fetters and strictures, which made it impossible to do anything, are gone. We are given possibilities. Let's find ways of what is the word? Leveraging on those possibilities, and seeing to what extent, we can then make the future, if not better for our children, certainly for our children's children. We cannot learn from history except not to make the mistakes that were done in the past.
Something I'd just like to clear up. We seem to be. I'm trying to find a nice euphemism to sort of express what I want to say, but I find that our conversation around and our conversation is centering around Mandela's legacy. I find that the conversation is becoming very binarist, in that we either looking to put blame or we looking at him as that sort of virtuous Christ-like figure. And the problem is that going back to that religious imagery, there's also the connotation of the scapegoat. We must understand that Mandela was not the key to all the problems, and at no point did he suggest that he was. he made it clear that this was just at the point where he was, and we find this in Bablanga's book, at the point where he was, he had done what he could, and that essentially freedom needed to be reconceptualized as is important, as is relevant, and obviously through key players, we see a development in the political climate. So if we're going to look back, and our sole judgment is on what we deem negotiation that didn't favor a particular sect of the population, we've got to understand that, and sometimes we fail to understand how insidious an institution apartheid was. And that in dealing with it, dismantling it, requires some sort of what did I say? Some sort of consideration, measured consideration, and these are the realities. In as much as radicalism is necessary, we were looking for a peaceful transition. We must not forget that the 80s were a violent time in South Africa's history. The realization was that the people on the ground fighting in the armed movement were fighting against a powerful institution. So obviously there needed to be some sort of balance, I think. And I think what it reveals about Mandela's leadership style is that he understood the intricacies and how to employ foresight in resolving what he couldn't during his term. And we see that reflected in that constitution.
Thank you. I know I said I wasn't going to weigh in, right? But there's a burning question that I have, and maybe my panelists can answer this at the end of the session. I think there is a need. I mean, it's natural, human nature. You know, when you find yourself in a situation that is unfavorable, or in a bad situation, whatever it is, you trace how it actually happened. And when you go back, you find this is kind of the source of it. And then you look up, you're like, okay, so who was responsible? I mean, you know, situation is, but somebody must have been responsible. And I think it's human nature to try to say, okay, right, whose face can I put to say this is the reason why, you know, we are in this problem before we even begin to kind of move. And I think I want to ask perhaps if the need to say Mandela sold out and all of that is not really, you know, perpetuated by a very real kind of need to put a person or a human being a face to a problem that we have to kind of make sense of what it is. I don't know if I do make sense, but to make sense of it. And I think there is that kind of need, whether it's justified or not, but it is there. And I think we'll continually go back, you know, to certain narratives that say, you know, Mandela probably sold out and so forth, because people who are experiencing what they're experiencing right now are starting to question, but how did this happen? I was going to say you don't have to answer that question now. You can answer it now or perhaps a bit later. But I think there is that which we cannot escape. May I take 3 more questions? The 2 gentlemen there, I've seen you. Samantha, I've seen you. Shall we start with Samantha, please?
I don't know if that was a good idea. No, thank you so much. And I just have 2 questions, and I'll try, even though, you know, politicians, we can speak for an hour, but I won't do that. I'll respect the space. I think for me, I just have 2, and I'm not sure between the 3 of you, because I think all 3 of you would have input to give to this particular question. So the first one is around the space of fluidity, in the sense that I often find, and please, I'm always subject to correction, just have an open mind, and if you want to problematize this, it's absolutely fine. But I often find that we are struggling between the individual versus the collective, right? And often, particularly in the context of a constitutional liberal democracy, where both of those institutions kind of have space. You know, you should be able to have the autonomy to be an individual, but as an individual, you have a responsibility to not forget the collective. But I want to understand from any one of the three, or all three, is it on the onus of the individual to take responsibility not to perpetuate a narrative or an image or a syndrome ascribed to them by media, by society, and so on, you know? And I'm not defending Mandela in any way, but I often found that, for example, rainbowism was ascribed to him. He was symbolic of that. And I kind of find it difficult to understand whether he himself perpetuated that to a certain degree, or if third forces kind of perpetuated that imagery. And I say that because rainbowism kind of became a commodity. It became commercialized. It was something you could sell at the time. And it had a monetary value attached to it, by the way. So, I don't know, just try and engage that. The second one, I just want to, very simple, Baba. I'm a big fan of yours. I've read your books. I haven't read this one yet. I'll get to it. But my question is centered around history is narrated for us to read and understand. Because I took history in high school, I'm sure many of us did. At the time, it wasn't compulsory. I see now it is. But I find history is taught to us in a certain way by certain people with certain intentions. And I find that problematic because now we had a particular history around Mandela taught to us. And because we've gotten to this stage, that history has become questionable, which makes me think history in general and the way it's packaged and taught to us, knowledge in general, knowledge production, and the way it's packaged and presented to us, is it not important for us and young scholars at high school level to be taught the skill of critical engagement? And I think as young people, we're getting robbed of that, you know. In conclusion, Siswam, I'll say that the reason I point this out is, you know, we have 2 million young people who are either in a university or TVET college, but we have 10 times that fold of young people who haven't accessed the space to kind of develop that skill and understand that everything that's packaged and presented to them is not necessarily truth. It's only packaged or presented for a certain intention and purpose. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. Butam, you can go.
Okay, I've got 2 statements of awareness. It's not a question. You mentioned Dr. Mandla ukuba ingxaki is that we run ourselves down. That's what you mentioned earlier. And I want to say we did not run ourselves down consciously. We were conditioned to believe that everything that is Western is bold and beautiful. As we are conscious now and still becoming, when we cry out loud, we are told that we are making noise. When we are becoming vocal in believing ourselves, we are told about hate and hateful speech. When we talk and even rejoice, we are always told that we are making noise. Just a typical example. Here at Nelson Mandela University, I attended a graduation here for the first time. When black parents rejoiced, ululating, they were told that they were making noise. How could you quantify joy like, no, just 2 seconds, then you stop? It is simply because they cannot relate. So what I'm saying right now is that you cannot quantify joy because we are always told that we are making noise. It is only because they cannot relate. Kuba bayazi ukuba when a black child is graduating, the whole village is graduating. So they can't relate. That is why in most cases you will see us looking down. Not that we are doing so because we want to, because the system is suppressing us. Second statement, Barrington, you mentioned that there needs to be some level of engagement and sacrifice. It always concerns me when I attend gatherings of this nature, because who are we going to engage with? Look at the demographics in this venue right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And I hear you. sorry to interrupt
no
you.
problem.
I definitely hear you. Before I came here, I taught at the University of Zululand, and it was one of the most amazing experiences of my life. And coming into this environment, being in faculty meetings and seeing representation and those sort of things, it sort of complicates the dynamic. But ultimately, we do have a voice. You've got that mic there, you can share, you know? So there are forums for engagement.
You may go, Pedro.
Chair, I just want to speak to the issue of that lady. A lady somewhere that side spoke to issue of the born freeze. From my little knowledge, I'm thinking these born frees are screaming out the silent voices of their parents or their great-grandparents that never got to express something that lasted decades to a reconciliation process of 2 years, only looking at the little glimpses and highlights of a bit of this, a bit of that, whereas the country itself, even now, the country is still bleeding. The wounds have not yet healed because of an overnight process that took place. And as you indicated, Baba, that when Madiba was in office, he was an administrator at the very same time. Before he's an administrator, guys, we must remember that he was a prisoner. Before he was a prisoner, he was a member of a society. Before he was a member of a society, he was a person. So him being a person he had his own flaws. He had his own good and bad, and that is some of the things that we need to acknowledge and say, as much as Madiba has done this and has spoken about a country that is rainbowed, I don't know how, but we must say that our country is still bleeding, and therefore we must allow a space for courageous conversations, because the reality is we want to decolonize. It's so exciting that in this university everything, hey, we can decolonize. To what extent are we decolonizing, and to which point? What is it that we must decolonize if the colonizer is not here to help us decolonize?
Thank you,
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Bob Mandla, do you want to take any of those comments?
Yeah, I will. I want to say that I'm very happy we're having this conversation, because some of the answers are not, fortunately, coming from this side of this divide here, but they are coming from that side also, and some of the suggestions are coming from yourselves. You raise a question regarding the need to blame someone, and I think that's a very normal human need. I've heard of people when they are angry, when they start stepping out, and then they say, I feel like punching somebody.
Yeah.
And I think in this instance, we do have the person that figuratively is being punched or can be punched, and that is Nelson Mandela. I do believe that this goes to something else that we also need to be incredibly aware of. I should also be aware of that. What is the building of a nation? What is the building of a society? How long does it take? How long is this child we call the new South Africa? It's about 20-something years. It's full of hormonal confusion. It's still trying to find its own feet. And when I'm saying that we are hard on ourselves, I'm saying we're hard on ourselves because, you know, when you wake up at night and then you've got a toothache, it doesn't matter how beautiful everything is in the house. You just have got this toothache and it's just going to bug you. And your vision, your view of life is clouded by the pain you're feeling. So most of us are having this toothache. And we do want a remedy, and the remedy must come not next Christmas, must come now. And I do think that we do need to be thinking about what are the, historians have got a word for this, the steps that have got to be taken to find for the country, for the society to stabilize in a manner where it can seriously then grapple with its own problems. You know, we come from an incredibly abnormal time. And I'm not even talking about the time of apartheid. Even the past 10 years, you know, has been a very, 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 very abnormal time, even when it comes to our own self-image. Hugh Masegelo passed away just sometime recently. Once told me, and you know, Brahi was always joking. He was talking about how South Africans, during the time of the struggle, anywhere they went, they were regarded, they could walk with their heads held high. But during this period when there was all this ferment, he says, you find someone from Ghana, from Burundi, from elsewhere, saying, hey, you South Africans, we pity you, you are in trouble. He says, in the past, when you went into a pub in London, and people said, this is a South African, someone would say, buy this man a beer. He says, but now it's very likely if someone says, this is South African, for someone to want to throw a pint of beer in your face. I'm just making this very light, but the truth is we slowly are finding in that constitution that we were unhappy about, we're finding that there are instruments that are helping small, as we would say in Nigeria, that are helping in resolving some of the problems that we ourselves have created. And I think we need to look at some of those things that are there, that are unchangeable. Even if we want to change the Constitution, there are things that are there which make sure that, you know, it's always, you must always look at life from the perspective of what happens when I'm in trouble. Don't look at it from the perspective that I'm, you know, eating high on the hog, I'm okay. Try and think. It's like lawyers. Lawyers are always thinking of litigation. What happens if always look at the worst case scenario. And in that way, you will, I think, find a way of leading life without very high expectations. Finally, my point on the rainbow thing. I think the word rainbow has been used almost a heck of a long time, many times. Yeah. I think the issue of the rainbow, I'm not saying that who said this, who said that, but I associate it a lot with the sermonizing that came out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And there are some very highly placed academics here and fact checkers. You can find out who was the first person who came out with the Rainbow Nation, and I bet you it was not Nelson Mandela.
It wasn't, it was Tutu.
Okay. Lastly, the issue of the canonization of making Mandela into a saint. He has said himself that he is not a saint. I'm a man with flaws, and he cites those flaws. He even says that he was not very brilliant at school. He failed his law studies a couple of times. Lastly, the issue of history. I think there's a point you made regarding the researching. I'm wary, for instance, of the point that's being made by government today of wanting to make history compulsory. I think what should be compulsory is making the love of research compulsory, not history.
Well, thank you very much. We've got pretty much 5 minutes left, and I'm going to ask Barrington to give us his final thoughts. And in the meantime, I believe Spogazi will be doing the vote of thanks. So we are unfortunately having to wrap this up. Barrington, just take it away, and then we call it a day.
Yeah, Bablanga, I can say that from a literary standpoint and appreciating the work for its literariness, what I noticed is that you don't describe any sort of literary analysis or interpretation against Mandela's manuscript, and that maintains the authority and tone of authenticity and not sentimentality in the accounts that are recorded. Like I said, the text complicates genre, and it traverses the lines between a dynamic historical account, a memoiric reflection, and ultimately contributing to a memory or archival project in terms of our political past. So I think it's a vital text in that regard. And it was an absolute pleasure reading it, engaging with it, and learning from it.
Thank you very much. Thank you. May I please call Spogazi to give us a vote of thanks?
Thank you so much, Sis Nobisa. Good evening, everyone. Not to waste any time, I think first of all, I want to thank you, Sis Nobisa. I think also understanding that you're a journalist and having just to apply some journalistic ethics here and discipline, if you wish, and not centralize what journalists would generally centralize within this conversation. So I think really appreciate the role that you've played in today's conversation. Thank you so much to Utata and to Barrington for leading the conversation. We have just some small gifts as a token of appreciation. This one's for you.
Oh.
Thank you. Thank you. I just wanted to say, just pertaining to the conversation, I think I'm reminded a lot you know, what Pumla Gola speaks in relation to Umamwini, and she talks about how much of what we know about Umamwini's legacy are things that have been meditated and have been created that inform ways in which we make meaning. And I think we can link that as well to the legacy of Utata 1, 2, to the interrogation of the presidency and him being the first democratic president. I think there are parts of the Mandela narrative that are comforting. However, there are parts of the narrative of Mandela that give us anxiety. And that anxiety is also informed by, firstly, decisions that he has taken to the moment, on the time that he had to make the decisions. And I think also, arguably, the people that were centered around him during the time that those decisions had to be made. But I think also just borrowing from the contributions that are coming from the floor, I think this interrogation also just arguably speaks into the generational trauma, right, that the woke gang and the born frees are experiencing. But I also think that it therefore places the responsibility on us to say, what kind of society are we trying to build? One, number two, what are the steps that we are going to take to build a different society and to produce a different generation? I think that's my 2 cents. Otherwise, I will continue. Thank you so much to everyone for contributing to the conversation and for taking time out. I understand that for the students here and for some of the academics here, we have exams starting in the following week, so good luck with that. Secondly, thank you, Marco, for recording. I know people generally don't thank, but it's important to us. Thank you so much in absentia to the kitchen staff that is not here. I also want to thank in absentia the Vice Chancellor. And I also think, you know, we have 2 days left of Africa Month celebrations, and these have not only been celebrations in this, to borrow from Uputi, this joyous element, but it's been a time for us to delve into the complexities that come with having the African identity and being a dynamic institution that's centered within the African continent. So we have Thursday and Friday and a range of events that I would like to encourage you to please attend and to please contribute to. Thank you so much and travel safely.